Hey guys, how's it going? Obviously I'm not there today. I wish I were there, because you know, whatever. Love seeing you guys. Love teaching you. Today we're going to do a really quick lesson. The second last system we're going to talk about, the nervous system. So we're going to get that, write that down, kind of talk about what that looks like, and then in time that remains, if you want to do some thinking about what's going to be your independent lab, your physiology lab, we talked a bit about that yesterday. You're welcome to kind of get together as a group and do that. But also, uh, if you could do a little bit of thinking, we should be starting our proper dissections tomorrow. And so if you haven't already, I'd love you to shoot me a message on Teams and tell me what your group is and which specimen it is you're planning to dissect, whether you want to do one of the pigs or the turtles. A few people have asked about other things. I'm flexible with that. You can go back and look at what we have available. I know I'd mentioned this yesterday. I'll mention it again today. I know some people were interested in doing the dogfish shark. I'm delighted to have you do the dogfish shark, but Boreal has now told me it won't arrive until January. So that's too late. If that's something you were really keen to do, you are welcome to join my 3U biology class next semester for dissection period, and you can join in with that, because that's certainly a good experience and one I want you to have if you can, but you can't have it this semester because I don't have it. So with no further ado, let's get going with today's lesson, shall we? The nervous system. I'm going to go fairly quickly just so this recording doesn't take a full hour, but of course, pause anytime you want to make getting this down and making sure it makes sense to you a priority. So we're going to talk today about the nervous system. So we'll say lesson 3.7, the nervous system. There we are. And the purpose of your nervous system is to sense the environment around us, I'm just going to say to sense the environment and respond and regulate responses to it. Now, what does that mean? To sense the environment and regulate responses to it. Well, we'll talk about it. So, but before we do that, let's talk about how it does what it does, and that'll help kind of clarify what's meant by this. So this involves several subsystems. What you think about makes sense, because what we need, as we said above, is we need to sense what's going on in the environment around us, and then we need to respond to it. So just to show a quick example, we might have some system where we said, oh, we're looking around and, the temperature is low, right? So this is just an example. So we detect a low temperature, right? And then what? Well, then maybe we light a fire. Maybe we go, okay, well, I'm going to put some logs on the fire here. These are my logs on the fire. They're really good looking logs. If you can't tell, I'm a very good artist. People often say to me, how'd you get to be such a good artist? I say, I don't know, it just happened. But there's fire in the fire pit, and we're going to take these and we're going to burn them, right? So we're going to start a fire. And why would we start a fire? Well, we'd start a fire so that we can do what? Well, so we can take the temperature and increase it, right? So this would be what we call a stimulus. Well, actually, I should say the stimulus comes in the form of, I don't know, comes in the form of, like, oh, there's snowflakes in the air. This is supposed to be a snowflake. I don't know if that looks remotely like it. So we could say, first, I guess, it gets cold. Then the low temperature is detected, and then we light a fire, and then the temperature increases. And, if you wrote all of that in the margins like I did here, if it became marginalia, we could just slide it over. So what I want to note here is that this is kind of how your nervous system functions, really, which is there's an outside stimulus of some sort. This just means a change in the environment. In this case, it meant it got cold outside. And then this is detected. And then a change is affected, right? Oh, sorry. I actually wanted to put that label here. So the change is affected. And why is a change affected? Well, the change is affected because we took some sort of action, which we could call a response. So this is the basic idea of our nervous system, which is that when there's stimulus in the environment, there's a response by our body, and that is regulated by the nervous system. So let's talk about that. What we have then is what we call the nervous system, this system that's going to see changes in our environment and respond to them. And we divide it into two main categories, what we call the central nervous system and the central nervous system is the brain and the brainstem and the spinal cord. And then over here, we have what's called the peripheral nervous system. Now, if you were a computer nerd in the 90s, these words would really jump out at you because we used to talk about central processing units and computer peripherals all the time. It's probably going to mean a little less to you right now, but basically, well, we'll talk a little bit about it. But basically, if we have senses and we have responses, those are kind of carried out by the peripheral nervous system. These kind of control the movement of information. And then we also have this idea of regulation, of regulating responses. And that's what's controlled by the central nervous system. We'll get into that in more detail, but basically what that means is that the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal column are involved in kind of the decision-making process, the control system. And for humans, that's a very sophisticated system, and there's some decisions that we can make very intellectually by doing a lot of kind of high-order thinking. And then there's some decision-making that we do very instinctively without thinking about it. If I come up behind somebody and, startle them, they react to that without doing any conscious thinking, but still their brain that's regulating that response. But the peripheral nervous system is all about getting information to the brain and then getting the information from the brain to where it needs to go. It's about moving information. So the central nervous system is about processing information, and the peripheral nervous system is about moving information. All right. Now, the peripheral nervous system gets divided up into two further categories. because we said it gets information from the body and that sends information to the body. So we give these kind of two distinct categories, what we call the sensory pathway and the motor pathway. All right. And so the peripheral nervous system, we have the sensory pathway, which sends signals from sensors to the central system for processing. And we have the motor pathway, which is from the central nervous system to the body to give instructions. And actually, in the motor pathway, we actually have two kind of distinct categories there as well, because there's some things that we control consciously and some things that we don't. Right? We have some things that happen and we have to think about them, and some things we don't. For example, right now, if you wanted to reach out and pick something up, your brain has to tell it to do that, and you have to think about it. You have to think, okay, I'm going to move my hand over here, I'm going to pick it up, and I'm going to move it. On the other hand, you don't have to think about your heart beating, for example, or you don't think about and control, at least very often directly, you're sweating or you're shivering or things like that. So we'll talk about that. Some things we control consciously and some things we don't. And these are called the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic sounds a lot like automatic, and it means basically automatic. It means that it happens on its own. It's autonomous, which means that it's under its own control, not yours. And then what we call the somatic nervous system. And if you're not used to somatic just kind of meaning regular, normal yet, you will be, because it comes up a lot in biology. But this is not under conscious control. That's kind of the organizational chart. All right, this is the basic idea, which is you have a nervous system, you have the brain, stem, and spinal cord, and the job of this is to process information versus the peripheral system, which is all about moving information. Okay, so how does this silly thing actually work? And again, pause this video anytime you need to draw this out. Well, let's talk about the cells of the nervous system. Neurons. Not just neurons, also something called glial cells and things like that. That's okay, we'll talk about. But there's connective tissue and things like that. But the primary cells of the nervous system are neurons. So the most important cells of the nervous system are the neurons. That was an S, believe it or not. All right, and then a group of neurons working together to send information or to process information, but just a group of neurons working together is a nerve. Which means, if you remember from our definition, a nerve is a tissue. They also contain cells called glial cells. All right, and these are kind of little companion cells. They handle waste, they provide energy, and provide structure. All right, now, what's a neuron look like? Well, neurons, like we said, are nerves which are all about moving information. And if you're going to move information, you have to cover a distance. So get ready for this. At its most basic, a neuron has sort of what we call a cell body. This will typically have a nucleus, just like any of the sort of cells we're used to, which will have some DNA in it. In your case, how many chromosomes? That is exactly right, Honesty. 46, 2 pairs of 23, 44 of those autosomal ones, and then 2 of them sex chromosomes. That's right. Okay, so this is what we refer to as the cell body. And it looks kind of just like most any other cell. But then a neuron has to transmit information. So it has, coming out of it, projecting from it, basically a big, long, membranous tube that can travel a great distance. All right, and it's also full of cytoplasm. I'm going to color a different color, not because they are green under a microscope or something, but just because we're trying to sort of be able to differentiate the different pieces. So coming off of the neuron is what we call the axon. And the axon carries an electric signal. I'm going to say an electrochemical signal. We'll talk about what I mean by that, but long story short, just like the wires in a computer, or well, computers don't have wires, but the circuitry in a computer carry an electrical signal, your nerves work by carrying an electrical signal. Now, it accomplishes this not by having like a copper wire in there that can carry electricity directly, but actually by using ions, by using pumps in the membrane to pump ions in and out to create an electrical signal that works its way down the axon. You don't have to worry too much in this course about how that happens, so it's a really interesting kind of process, but it outputs a signal. And I'm going to show that signal just here. It sends a signal down the axon, and only ever down the axon. But of course, how does it know to send a signal? Well, it's got to get signals. Nerves send signals down their axons, but they can receive signals as well. And most nerves only send signals in one direction, but most nerves can receive signals from many different directions. And so most cells have multiple kind of branches of kind of tube-like membranes coming into the cell from many different directions, because they're able to get signals from more than just one cell. And so the result is that it ends up almost looking a little bit like a tree on its side. And in fact, that's where the name for these things come, because these, we would kind of say they look like branches. And that's what scientists thought when they first started looking at nerves too. So they called them branches. But of course, being fancy pants, they didn't call them branches. They called them dendrites, which is Latin for, you guessed it, branches. I think that's Latin. That could be Greek. That could, well, we should look it up, so I'm not shaming myself here. Also, you will note I did a really bad job coloring in the lines there. Try to do a good job coloring in the lines when you do it. These are the dendrites of the nerve, and they receive signals. Oh boy, I drew all that without showing it. I can only imagine what you were looking at there. Probably my ugly face looking confused as I tried to draw. Sorry about that. So take a minute and let's just look at that. You can pause the video. So there we have what a neuron looks like. All right, assuming you're back here. So signals can come in along any of these. And if enough signal comes in, then the neuron will fire itself and send its own signal down here. And nerves are kind of either on or off. They're either sending a signal or not. The way the human nervous system works and the way animal nervous system works is that our neurons don't kind of send partial signals. They either send a signal or they don't, for the most part. And no matter what type, signals come in through the dendrites. And if enough signal is received, the nerve sends its own signal down the axon. Just to give one example of this, if you had a nerve whose job was to tell your sweat glands to start producing sweat, they would receive some signal saying, hey, getting hot in here, getting some signal from that, like from the brain saying, oh, hey, we're starting to get hot. And all of a sudden, when they've got enough signal, then they will switch on and say, hey, tell that sweat gland. Geez, I'm having tech issues now. This hasn't happened to me in a long time. But I'm back online now, so hopefully you're seeing the signal again. So now let's talk about what they basically do. Well, there's three types of nerves. I should say neurons. This is also true of nerves, but I want to be consistent with what I had written here. There's three types of neurons. The first are what we call sensory. And these are for input. All right? They receive stimulus at the source. And they send info, I should say they send signals to the central nervous system. All right, what are some examples of these? Well, these could be your sense neurons. In other words, they could be heat sensors, or they could be the rod and cone cells of your eyes. We talked about stretch sensors in your gut, right? That tell the alimentary canal when to squeeze and move food by peristalsis. They could be what else? I mean, all kinds of things. I'm not going to write it all day, but there we are. They could be receptors. So this is, for example, for hormones or neural transmitters. Okay, the second type of neuron we call integration neurons. All right, and the integration neurons are the ones in your central nervous system. All right, and these are designed to process signals. All right, these are like the circuits of a computer. So they receive signals from sense neurons, and produce output signals that travel down the third type, which is motor neurons. I like a red underline better, I think. Much better. All right, and motor neurons carry signals from the central nervous system to organs, muscles, glands, etc. All right, so an example of these would be the cells of your brain, by the way, when we talk about the integration, brain cells, but also neurons in the spinal cord. Not all of them. Some of the neurons in the spinal cord are just sensory and motor neurons, but I should say some neurons in the spinal cord also carry information. These run from brain and spinal cord. Sorry, no, they don't. That's a lie. These run from the body to the spinal cord and brain. And the motor neurons run from the brain and the spinal cord to the body, to the rest of the body. All right, we're not going to get too deep in the weeds of how this works. This is complicated stuff, all right? Deeply, deeply, deeply complicated stuff. You could easily, very easily, take a whole course just on neural biology. I took a few courses just on neural biology. It's fascinating stuff, all right? Really, really, really fascinating stuff. But I want to look at two examples of just two of billions of examples of how this can work, an example of what it might look like. And I want to use an example of a hot stove. Not the stove itself, but our response to it. So two examples of us using our nervous system, all the pieces of it. The first would be, notice the stove is hot. And put your pan on it. So if you have an electric stove, you probably put the pan on and then you turn the heat on. But I have a gas stove, and it always just seems to light a little better if I light it first. So if I'm in the kitchen and I'm wanting to use the stove, this obviously is my stove. It's an amazing looking representation of my stove. And there's some knobs here that control each of the burners, right? And then there's like a door here, and there's that, and there's like a window. Okay, so there's my stove. And what happens is, yeah, I've done some motor neuron stuff, and I've lit one of the burners, but now what we're going to talk about is just what happens. So now the burner is lit, and I've got a flame going, so I'm like ready to put my food on. Only, how do I know that I'm ready to put my food on? Because we just take for granted that that happens. But actually what has to happen is, like, I have to be here, and I'm going to be like 80% of like grade 9s I teach, where instead of paying attention in class, I'm just going to draw an eye. Only I'm a terrible artist, so they always do these like very like detailed, and there's like lashes and things like that. Okay. And then like here's the iris and the pupil and all kinds of things. It's always very intense. It's very impressive. I'm always like, wow, you're very good at drawing eyes. But okay, there we go. So I have an eye, and the eye is designed so that when light strikes it, it can process that information. So this is where we have a sensory pathway, which means we have a sensory neuron here. What we actually have is inside my eye is a little neuron that has an axon, a cell body, and it has dendrites. And those dendrites come from the like light sensor itself. So we have rod and cone cells that send signals down there. They get processed here, and they get sent along the axon. So specifically, we could say that retinal cells, the cells of the retina of my eye, they detect light. In this case, colored light, some blue light. So red, blue, orange, all this light that says, that would say it's a flame. Now, it doesn't know that it's seeing a flame. It just knows that it's seeing red, blue, and orange light. And it sends this signal, just got some red, got some blue, got some orange, sends signals to the brain. So what happens there then is that when we leave the eye, which is the sensory pathway, and now we go to the spine and the brain. If you're wondering, does that mean you're going to get to watch me draw a brain? Oh, you bet it does. The trick to drawing a brain is just do a crappy job drawing a cloud, and then another little cloud here, and then we can draw like the spinal cord here. Okay. There, and then we gotta make it look all folded, right? And okay, there we go. So there's the brain. So now what happens is that this signal gets sent to the brain. And in fact, inside the brain, we can see that we have neurons in here whose job is again to collect information along its dendrites, and send them along its axons, right? And so information comes pouring in from probably a few sensors saying, hey, we're seeing red light. And a bunch of these interact with each other, and they have circuits that determine when they're seeing certain combinations of red light and blue light and orange light in certain shapes, that this is a flame. So circuits of brain neurons interpret these retinal signals and they say, that's a fire. Other circuits determine the response. In this case, not sound the fire alarm, because in this case, it's fire that we made on purpose, which in this case is put pan on fire. And now a signal is sent to muscles. And of course, not just one muscle, there's a bunch of muscles. Right? This is another one of those things we just take for granted. But if you want to put a pan on a stove, you've got to coordinate lots of actions. You've got to move your feet, 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, you have to be coordinating your legs the whole time so you don't fall over. But we're going to coordinate that motion and walk over, and we're going to coordinate the motion of our shoulder and our upper arm and our elbow and our forearm and twist, and we're going to move, and we're going to put a pan on the stove. Actually, an incredibly complicated thing to do. But that's okay, because this is what our integration system does. It receives signals, it interprets them, and then it sends those signals along down motor pathways to actually turn into actions. I just want to make sure I turned that. I did. Okay. And so now signals get sent, and when the signals get sent here, where they get sent is to the motor neurons, right? And so here we have, obviously, my stove again, which is a very good looking stove. Looks just like a real stove because I'm a very gifted visual artist. So there is my stove. And the burners on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk over to the stove with my pan, very safely, of course. And I'm going to put the pan on the stove, right? So we've got flames here on the stove. If your stove ever looks inflamed like that, my advice would be not to do it, but we're going to put the pan on the stove, right? And so signals from brain travel down motor neurons and control muscles. This, by the way, was a conscious decision. So if you look here, this involved our central nervous system. This involved sensory pathways coming up to the central nervous system, which then made the decision to move the pan, which then moved down motor pathways into our somatic nervous system. So in this case, what we had was from the peripheral, specifically sensory pathway, to the central, and then back down the peripheral, but in this case, the motor pathway, and specifically the somatic, right? And just to remind us what all those words mean, this sensory means gather information. And they send to the central nervous system. The central nervous system's job is to process information. And then the peripheral system, the motor is to send commands to body systems. There's two M's there if you can't see. That was terrible. And somatic means it's under conscious control. All right, so you can take a minute and put that up. Well, if that's an example that's under our conscious control, what else could happen with a stove? Well, just to show you some of the ways that things aren't under our conscious control, and there's a million ways, but one of these would be a reflex pathway. And again, there's a million examples we could do. You can take whole courses in this. But an autonomic reflex response, autonomic reflex response. And what we mean by autonomic is that it's outside of our conscious control, and reflex means that it's in response to some stimulus. So let's go back to the stove, shall we? Let's say this time, I've got my ear pods in, an AirPod, I don't know what the heck you Apple users use, but I was trying to sound hip and cool like I'm an Apple user, not like a Samsung user, which is what I really am. Anyway, because apparently these things are important. Let's say that after I'm done cooking, I've finished cooking and the flame is off, but unbeknownst to me, this burner is really hot. And I, in all my wisdom, stand here. I'm going to have to stand a little closer, I think. I stand here, and I reach out, and I put my hand on the burner. What's going to happen to me? Maybe I'm wearing some sunglasses. And I got lots of hair. And I have a hand here too. Okay, there we go. What's going to happen? Well, again, if we look here, we're going to see that we have sensory neurons whose job is to detect heat. And if I put my hand on a hot stove, here's the axon, or here's the cell body rather, there's the axon, here are the dendrites. Those dendrites are going to be screaming because there's going to be a bunch of receptors in my skin that say, whoa, man, this is really hot. We're going to get a really, really, really strong signal out of all of those axons saying, hey, whoa, big heat, or those dendrites rather, saying big heat coming in. And the cell body is going to take that signal and send it on down the axon. Well, to where? So, so the signal is received via the dendrites, and that signal is sent down the axon. And as that signal gets sent on, we know, just like before, that this is the peripheral nervous system, right? And specifically, it's sensory. And so its job is to receive signals, receive info, and send signals to the central nervous system. All right, that's cool. So now, that's our sensory pathway here, right? But now from there, we go to our integration. But in this case, neurons are fast, but they're not instantaneous, and they don't move like wires in your computer do at the speed of light. They actually move a bit slower than that. And if we burn ourselves, we want to move our hand real quick. And in fact, our body is designed to not have to think about it. Your body is designed so that it can respond quicker than having to go to the brain. Your brain is very smart and it's good at making decisions, but because we have to think about things, when it makes decisions, there's lag. If I tell you to make a decision, you have to think first, then act. And in this case, the body doesn't actually want to do that. So in this case, we actually send this signal. So here I am again. I've got lots of hair, got a neck, and I've got a torso, those fingers on here, and now, oh, and I have legs and feet. There we are. Okay, and I've got a hand that is sending signals like this. And here's what it does. It actually sends it to the spine. Specifically to the spinal cord, which is the bundle of nerves that runs up the spine, protected. So it runs it to our spinal cord. And your spinal cord, in this case, has its own central nervous system integrator pathways, which has its in integration neurons. In other words, your spine actually has some decision-making power. What your spine has is these, if we zoom in on it, I'm not going to use red. I shouldn't have used red the first time. But if we zoom in on it, it has this cell whose axons come from the skin. And again, just like we said, they're getting signals saying, hey, whoa, we got a bad burn here. And their dendrite actually, I said it backwards. The dendrites come from the skin, but their axons actually go back to the skin as well. And so when they get a signal, they send it back. So they receive from heat sensors in the skin, but they send directly to muscles. And that means in the next step, they send their signal not to the brain for processing, but actually they just send it to this arm and they say, whoa, hey, pull that thing up. And they send this signal very quickly, basically to say, let's get out of danger here. Then we'll think about it. And if you've ever burned yourself, your hand will pull away from a really hot stove before you even feel that it's hot. All right, so we're going to get a big motion here where the arm swings up. And the reason the arm moved is because that signal came from the spine to the biceps. And in that signal chain, there is, the dendrites here that receive that reflex signal. The dendrites there receive the reflex signal, and they send it along the axon to the muscle. So this is signal from the spine, and this is sent to the bicep. Contract. Right? Just like that. And we move it. So, in this case, we have the peripheral sensory system, which receives signals to the CNS. And then we also here have the integration. In this case, it's a reflex pathway in the spine which tells the hand to move off the stove. And then the motor neurons, right, which are peripheral, they send the signal. They actually control the muscle. And in this case, we refer to this as being autonomic because it's not under conscious control. All right, so that's where we're going to leave it for today, just with two examples of how our nervous system can receive information from our sensory neurons, how we can sense the environment, how we have a system designed to regulate what we want to do with that information and make up a response, and then the actual response itself, where we send a signal to make a change to the body to respond to the environment. And we looked at sort of how the peripheral nervous system is involved in getting the information to the brain or the central nervous system, and in getting the information from the brain back to the body, that this can be done automatically, which a lot of things are, or consciously, which some things are, and how the central nervous system's job is to take all that information and make decisions. We looked at the neuron, and we looked at the types of neurons, which really, if we know this system, it makes perfect sense that we have three types. We have some whose job is to get information to the brain, some whose job is to make decisions either in the brain or reflexively in the spinal cord. And then we have motor neurons whose job is to send that information off. And just remember that motor makes you think that it has to be a muscle, but it doesn't have to be a muscle. It could also be a gland, or it could be an organ, something like that. Though often it's a muscle. A lot of what we do is moving. So I hope that made some sense. I hope that was clear. We will talk tomorrow. You should have about 30 minutes left. Please use that at your convenience to do whatever it is you need to be doing, but be productive. Don't waste time.